So, throughout the last 2 days, we've been talking about a lot of different issues. And what I said I was going to do yesterday was pull the key words together into one place that we can all see and think about. And then I'm going to take notes on the conversation that takes place, that this generates. And this, of course, is also being recorded. So we'll have a recording of this conversation, plus we'll have notes. And I'll follow my forum up with a second slide with the kind of topics and ideas that we come up with. But the main idea for this forum is to think about how we can dream together. What kinds of ideas, what kinds of visions, inspirations can we develop that help us think through some of the challenges and provide some insights and take us a step further than where we already are. And so here are just some of the ideas that I've heard over the last 2 days. It's not a complete list, and sometimes these issues were repeated and reiterated. So I will take notes, but I want to kick off one idea that we haven't talked about necessarily, although Scott did talk about some issues of pedagogy, but the idea that pedagogical is an important part of what we're talking about because research and teaching sometimes go hand in hand. And so in my program that I direct at the university, we teach VR. And so we have teams of students that produce projects for local companies from Seattle down to Portland. And so I'd like to throw that out as one idea, but here are some of the issues that we've discussed thus far. Yesterday, Sam Brooker talked about community and social. Cynthia Haynes, intentional, the idea that text is intentional. It's different than thought because many times it takes us much more time to think through what we're going to write as opposed to what we're going to say. Preservation, sustainability. Lanier talked about the mystical belief in people. Laidlaw talked about love. We also saw a discussion today about the ethical use of technologies, the notion of creativity through Scott's presentation, co-creation, collaboration, spatial and temporal, which I thought was a fascinating talk that Eduardo gave, accessible, Dina Larson, and augmented by Perlin. So here are some ideas that we have already generated. And so where can we go once we move from this symposium today? And I'd open this up to anybody. I'm going to quit sharing this screen and I will drop the slide into the chat for everybody, okay? So give me just a second. Okay. So let's start with some comments as I move this slide into our channel. Okay, just give me a second.
How is the voice now? Can you hear us?
Yes,
yep, now it's good.
Okay, good.
And Rhoda, can I ask if you can fix the chat so that people can chat to each other? I was not able to send out chats to the general group earlier.
No, I cannot because there's something odd with my login. Okay. So I apologize. Hang on, let me just check something specific. Yeah, I don't know. I'm sorry about that.
Okay.
Now, since I'm the first one standing up, you know, what we're talking about specifically now, because we've had so many issues highlighted over the last 2 days, so many perspectives on VR and AI, is quite simply, what do you want? You know, let's say you have a headset and it's 3 years in the future, it's affordable, the technical quality is very, very high, not too expensive, not too heavy, all of that, it's just solved. It's just very much like Ken's glasses that he pointed out, right? What do you want it to be? And I'm just going to kick this off by what Fabian was saying. We used to work in 3D, and then it's been constrained to these little rectangles. So I would like to see in the very beginning my own desk with, you know, pens and paper and things that just happen to be magical. That should be the first step. And I should be able to access that anywhere. But when I'm at work, home, or coffee shop, it may be different. I think that is a basic VR dream. So I'm wondering what you would either like to disagree, which is great for dialogue, or if there's something you'd like to layer on top of that.
I would push back a little bit on what we want. I would like to think that it's about what we need. So take a little bit of more of an ethical stance, because what we want might be things that would hurt other people, that may impact other people in negative ways. But what we need might be different, a different approach. I don't know how other people feel about that.
I think we can arm wrestle over espresso when we meet each other on that. But
Sounds
uh,
good. Alan's got his hands up.
yeah, please feel free to go in either directions. I think it's worthwhile we have a kind of disagreement. I'm just going to move the transcript up there. Yes, Alan and Dene, please continue being the chair. I just wanted to make that first statement.
Okay. Alan, would you like to speak?
Sure, yeah, thank you. And Dene, thank you for, I love the categories of association with everyone. So I think on both the answer of what I want and what we need, my opinion of that is we need tools to figure out how to talk about this wide range of things. I mean, we just heard about chalk talk, and along with that, an entire philosophy of working with technology. Right before that, we heard a different philosophy that, wove together somewhat, but they were different angles. There's the 2D, having the 3D experience to the 2D and wanting to try and get back to the 3D. I hear all of these as being, first off, way more immersive of the technologies, not just VR, but engaging in tools for thought, engaging in oral interfaces, multimodal. But every time we come up with a new word, it almost sucks all the hype out of the room, and it takes all the attention, and it becomes very hard to talk about a holistic approach and the various kind of islands of interest within that holistic approach, right? So, and one of those could be what is our responsibility ecologically or politically to whatever new tool, and another one could be, how do I get rid of documents and categories and just use my AI as a dialogue machine. So to shorten that down, I would love to come away with some kind of framework so that we all know what we're talking about.
Thank you for that. I just wrote that down, and I just noticed that Caitlin wrote in the chat she wants easier expressive tools, which I think a lot of us do want. Bob Horn had his hand up. Bob, did you want to say something? You disappeared off my screen for a second.
Well, I think that I appreciate your asking the question of what we need, because that's what I'm focused on these days. As I said yesterday, I think in a discussion like this, it would be handy to both have the what we see as the opportunities right at our boundaries. I still don't have a list of what our frontier is today. When am I stepping across the frontier of virtual reality? I need lists and lists of little snippets of examples. Probably 20 or 25 of them are needs that we would need to do even a little bit better virtual reality tomorrow. And I'm sure that this room could come up with that list if we wanted to. And then there is the longer range question of what it is that we need. And that has to do, for me, with how we together can think together about extremely complex subjects, which I talked about yesterday. And a lot of that has to do with coming to common understandings of our different ways of portraying, of representing to each other our major challenges, which I used the million-year challenge of radioactive waste as an example yesterday. That's a big challenge that's going to have to be around for a long time. We need to be communicating better about it today and for the next million years. I'll stop there for now.
I think those are really important questions, Bob, but I think in this short hour that we have, what would really be nice if we pretend that Meta just went bankrupt and they gave us all their money and we're tasked with building a knowledge environment in VR. So it's like, oh my gosh, we have to bring something to market just to help us really clarify our dreaming about the environment, the tools, the system. What do we actually, in these few years, when we put that headset on our head, what do we want to be able to actually see and do? What would, if this was a product, what would you actually want to spend money on rather than something general? Because yes, we agree on better expression, better understanding, better communication. But Caitlin is going to comment on exactly what she means. And then we have Fabian right there.
I'm actually going to come in a tiny bit sideways on this, only to say, not to derail this, but that there's another way in, because I think if we only start off from our perspective of what we would do blue sky, we are left with us and we are unchanged. So I think one of the things that we have to do is engage with varieties of technologies. I love thinking about the edges, but also to assume that we can use these as machines to help us to understand ourselves outside of ourselves. So that's why we get poetry, and that's why we also can end up potentially with non-dominant positions. We don't simply want to reproduce ourselves with all of Meta's money, but I'm curious to see what people would spend it on, but it wouldn't be my first.
I would like to also add to this, because this on the same track, what we want to think about is representing a whole different ways of thinking. So it's not just science, a scientific approach or a technological approach, but it's also an artistic approach, practical approaches. And I think what's great about this group we have assembled, that Frode, you've brought together for Future of Text, is that we do represent a variety of disciplines and methodologies. And it would be good to continue to kind of build in other ways of thinking, other types of people, other life experiences, because that matters. I mean, Dene talked a lot today about accessibility. I don't know how many of us have physical disabilities, but having one person in the room with that helps us all to understand the kinds of issues that we need to be thinking about as able-bodied human beings, right? But there's other things as well. There's cost, how to make VR more affordable. My students can't afford their own systems at home, so they rely on the two rooms, the two spaces we have on campus to be able to do VR. So there's a lot of things we can think about. I see Peter's hands up, and then also Ken. So Peter, why don't you take over?
I'll have to go, because otherwise I'm going to stand here too long. You're going to see my face for too long. Sorry to do that. In terms of like very low level, let's say, and I want to say a bit, maybe pragmatic is a bit pushing it, but what I'm dream of and what I try to do a little bit with the workshop is to go back on this idea of workspace, more specifically for VR, but I think it's a bit more general than this, is if you design your own workspace and you have your little piece of information, it's more the tools you go through. So for example, a pen, a pencil, the different comments you're going to use. So my dream there is that for each of us who does start to design their workspace to potentially use in VR, to have those list of commands, not because I'm curious about how you work, but potentially as a repository of how those different commands in VR to manipulate information could be shared, so that we don't have to, each of us, re-implement all that. So for more the interoperability aspect of how to manage spatial information in VR.
Thank you for that. I think I see Peter's hands up.
Okay, I think an important theme for us to think about is attention management. What do we do if we have a wonderful little VR simulation of, say, a Japanese garden with a koi pond in it? And that's all wonderful when you have 5 or 6 people who want to be in the garden. But what happens when 60,000 people from all over the web want to go into the same room at the same time? How can we control things so that we see a manageable number of other participants and manage to bring only those participants that we want to be interacting with sort of into phase with us, as if sort of imagine, you know, a million parallel dimensions, all with the same physical model, but different slices of it with different beings and look different things. And then the other thing I'd really like to see would be mixed materials fabrication capability, so that you could build something in VR and then have it constructed somewhere else that would arrive, and it might have an electrical wiring component, and it might have a plastic or wood laminate shell built somewhere else, and maybe some fabric elements combined. So instead of having to go to a bunch of different 3D printers and try to figure out how to integrate, it'd be nice if someone could provide the ability to fabricate virtual objects as real objects, which would mean you have to have some constraints in the simulation to ensure that whatever you're building is going to be something that could be fabricated, but afterwards sort of start automating those construction processes. So I could build something in VR and then have it actually arrive in a crate a week later.
Thank you for that. I was also looking in the chat and saw Matthias wrote, and I'm just condensing this and see if I said this right, Matthias. Rethink the role of text in VR when text is not necessarily needed. Did you want to expand a little bit on that before I move to Ken?
Well, yes. I really liked Frodo's introductory word saying we are in a point in time where we can redefine how to interact with text, because VR is kind of new to all of us. So I was thinking about what's the purpose of text, written text. And if we engage in a VR environment together with each other, then we talk like we do now. So why do we need text? So text might be something like a time capsule that someone later might pick up on certain thoughts. So I'm really struggling with the idea, what's the purpose of text in VR now for the time when people are on the same virtual space? That's just the beginning of my reasoning. Please go on from there.
Ken, did you want to respond or make a comment? Ken, can you hear me?
Oh, sorry. I thought you were talking with somebody else because I wasn't responding to him. But I mean, I can respond to him, which is, I mean, I use text all the time, and I'm in a very, very high quality simulation with the people I'm in a room with. We speak, we have eye contact, we have gesture, and we still find it useful to have text. So text serves a complementary purpose to our verbal speech. And I don't think that VR and XR become mature and start getting more and more of the shared qualities of this shared physical world. I think the complementary superpowers of text will still serve us. And so that's just that. But what I wanted to say was that I just into the higher that's right. It also accessibility. Very, very good point. Right. It levels the playing field very, very effectively in many ways, as Dene pointed out. But I wanted to point out, pursuant to the whole larger conversation, two things. One is that in 1999, when Harry Potter finally got to the US and I got to read the book, I realized that J.K. Rowling had written to me a definitive text on HCI, because she's asking the question, not how do we make this, but what do we want? And all of the magic, when the Arthur C. Clarke quote, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, sort of was like, hey, people want to be able to have people move in paintings. They want to be able to look at a map and see where people are. And, a lot of things she wrote about now are part of her everyday life, even though they didn't exist in 99. And I wanted to mention that because I think that's a good way to think about things, is what do we want, not start with how do I build it? And in a very different rhetorical framework, but still just as fictional, when I talk to my graduate students, I used to talk about the holodeck, but now I talk about the Jedi Council, because I think we're just sitting around talking and somebody happens to not be here. Why should they be treated differently because they're in a different physical location? We should have all the superpowers that our bodies and minds evolved to have, the pointing, the gesturing, the looking, the spatial coordination, all of it, the spatial audio, And then any superpowers you want to add on top of that. We shouldn't start out by being an impoverished space because we happen to have computers from a sensory cognitive level. So I just wanted to sort of put that energy into the conversation.
Thank you. And I also want to mention back when I was with Cynthia Haynes, University of Texas at Dallas, when she had just come to our university. I was a graduate student. She brought the MOO with her and built the Lingua MOO system there. One of the things that we all imagined at the time was that we'd be able to walk into a space and experience text completely surrounded by that. So text would become an immersive environment. And in doing so, it would help us understand the text better. It would help us be able to absorb information, come up with new ways of thinking. It was really a wonderful vision. And then later, Noah Walter Fruin developed a project at the Cave called Screening, in which he did almost exactly that. And so I encourage you, if you go online, I'll find the chat, the URL and put in the chat. But the idea that text inside the VR space helps us engage with text in a way that we don't when it's separate from us. Stephanie's hands up. And we'll go to Mark Anderson.
I endorse the fact that we're going to continue to need text, but if you're trying to discuss a legal document, for instance, of any length, the Constitution, it's very helpful to have this document right there for you to reference. And so you cannot reproduce that by a conversation in hand gestures. And with respect to something like being surrounded by text, to me, this goes back to the question I had for Eduardo. In a non-gravitational space, which you can, if you can adjust the physics of your space, you can have this, or in other words, text may vary for the physics of the space that you're in. If you need to be able to read letters and symbols upside down and from any angle, and they still have to make sense for you, that's a specific design problem. And I imagine that the text will, it'll characterize, it's like the gerrymandered font perhaps, but hopefully better, is that the particular symbols and text that you use will be specific to the physics of the space that you're in.
Thank you, Stephanie. And Mark Anderson standing there. Hi, Mark, how are you, dear?
Can you hear me all
Good to
right?
see you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Do we need to turn them on?
Yes.
You can hear me, right? I want to. So I'm going to try and draw together a few strands. And something was brought to mind, prompted by Dene's comment earlier about accessibility, and I'm thinking back to conversations that we've had in our weekly talks about embodiment. And my thoughts went on terms of accessibility went in a slightly different way. I've just been reading Ed Yong's In the Men's World about the senses across the animal kingdom and just how different they are. And so one of the things I'd like to do is to be able to have, in a sense, more of those different senses. And so if you look at other form of differences and sort of like neurodiversity and the fact, well, we were talking earlier at lunchtime about things like synesthesia. And, you know, as this is a constructed world and we get to play with its reality, but play is perhaps the wrong word, couldn't we make a more expressive representation, which brings it back to the text, because the ways in which we can interact with the text, or the images or the symbols that we create from the text, we might be able to have a much richer interaction with them. As I say, it's a dream. I don't have an answer there, but it's just a provocation, I guess.
Thank you for that. Others? Stephanie, your hand's still up. I don't know if you want to make another comment, or if it's just up from the last one.
I'd love to
Yep.
Yes, Brendel Zachunak here. I'd love to echo what Mark was saying about senses. One of the two sort of sources for me of interest in virtual reality and text in virtual reality, one is Andy Clark and Chalmers' extended mind thesis. The other is an article from Wired magazine by Sunny Baines in 2007 called Mixed Feelings, where she goes through a survey of the then current sort of set of sensory prostheses. These devices, electrical devices of various kinds that are used to either replace or invent entirely new senses. And I feel like while some of those things are a little bit offbeat, people using things to buzz on their wrist to represent colors, that they all exist on a continuum between resources and actual sort of primary senses. And it strikes me that, you know, when we assemble spaces for making sense of things, a couple of people talked about cooking, that for the most part, we understand them as being sort of present and assembled for the benefit of the ingredients or for the task. But in no small part do they end up being assembled in such a way for our own cognitive purposes. I really look forward to a flexibility of continuum of things from immediate sort of primary senses through to more abstract resources that we can have on hand, in large part because I don't believe that what's just up in the head is very much in comparison to what sort of first order, second order organization and arrangement we put around ourselves for the benefit of being able to do the process of creation and sense making, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you. Barbara's hand is up. Barbara, we can't hear you. Are you having some issues with sound? Maybe your sound needs to be turned on. You had it off, perhaps. Can't hear you. Do you have a headphone or some sort of microphone plugged in? You might want to unplug that. Can you put your comment in the chat? That would be that we could get around this problem by the chat. So why don't you do that while you... In the meantime, I saw a comment.
Here, do you hear me now?
Perfect, yes.
Okay, my problem is I can't get audio on my computer.
Okay.
I can only get it on my phone, so I'm on twice. And right. So I wanted to echo a couple of comments, particularly Ken, and I think we have to think about what do we want VR for? And what we want it for, then the next question is, what aspects of it do we need? I have many students who are interested in technology. They get all excited. They want to use it for everything. And I say, compare it to paper and pencil. What are the advantages and why? What do we need this increase in media for? And what are its advantages and disadvantages? So there are many possible uses. Some are like now conversing, and we've seen some of the challenges even for Zoom, and they're going to be greater. And so what are the advantages here, disadvantages? There are there's teaching, there's working. I've been working with a team around Steve Feiner, where we've been using mixed reality to make workers who are doing assembly line tasks with each other, allowing them to collaborate better and faster. And then you think through exactly what do you need and what do you need to highlight. And there it's the hands. And it's each other's hands and it's their perspective. So you want to think through what this is for and what you need to facilitate that particular interaction. So there's entertainment, there's group meetings, there's teaching, there's actual job work, there's making music together, there's making art. I could go on, but I think treating it as a unitary thing doesn't make sense. The other thing I wanted to say is we have to recognize that VR is mediated. It's adding an additional layer to the way we're communicating and interacting anyway. Now, you could say that mediation happens anyway because our sense organs mediate. They filter out what sounds, what sights, what haptic, kinesthetic information we want or we need. So even our interfaces, the ones we come into the world with and develop and evolve with experience, those are mediated. They're cutting out a great deal of information and they're pre-processing a great deal of it. So adding VR or any technology increases the mediation. VR particularly emphasizes sound and sight, not necessarily space, because space is often distorted and spatial relations are distorted. I mean, everything is somewhat distorted, it's filtered. So how do we do that filtering, and why, and what are we missing? And on what we're missing, I think there's a great deal our own sensory input is missing. There are ranges of sound and sight and hearing that we don't get. Now, technology can give us that. And it can give us that in different forms. And that might increase our creativity, our communication ability, and so forth. So I think we also want to think about the complement of what human perception and what VR can do. The things is, what's it missing? And how can we get that into the stream, and how might that be useful?
Very, very.
Along those lines, let me just mention, Frodo, along those lines, Richard Snyder writes in the chat, for me personally, the most thrilling thing about VR has been getting my VR legs, actually almost feeling the effects of neuroplasticity as my brain adapts to the machine. So I think that speaks to what you're talking about, Barbara. Frodo, we have someone there at the conference live.
This one?
Yes.
Yeah, no, that's Fabian. But just really briefly, because you touched on a key thing there, Barbara, really worthwhile questions about what we can do with our other sensory systems, which you so eloquently write about as well. For this session, though, I really think, because we don't have all the time in the world, just looking at my watch there, we should focus on working in VR, at least partly with text, because there will be conferences and symposium on, social meetings and medical and education. That will happen. That's going to explode like crazy. So I think our core value as a community is to really focus on, okay, I've done my things, and I'm going to put it on because I've got to get this document read or created or whatever. So just in terms of focusing here. Yes, Barbara. And you're muted.
Barbara, you're muted.
So we need VR headset with automatic unmute. Okay, that's one.
Okay, it's unmuted on my phone. So I think as someone who has difficulty hearing, the closed captioning is just essential. I find it essential for teaching because I teach students from many different language backgrounds. So they may know English, but the accent is hard. So, that's just one small reason for adding text, but I'm a huge fan of text, often just abbreviated text, telegraphic text. Yeah, we need it. Comics are always my go-to thought through medium, because comics use text, visuals, and really ways of communicating sound and motion in such creative ways, and they add hugely to the meaning.
Yeah, thank you.
So to go back a little bit also on both the mediated aspect of it and some of the maybe naivety we can have about it, but also what I was a bit arguing before in terms of seeing everything pretty much as interfaces, and try to always, for quality interface, being able to push through, have an escape valve so that you can manage the interfaces itself built upon. In terms of dreaming, for me, it's pretty clear that we cannot have closed systems. So if we don't rely on open source, if we don't rely on specification, if we don't rely on interoperability, and also for the purpose of accessibility, we cannot have something that is inclusive. We cannot have something that we can challenge, understand. So if we build this amazing virtual world, hopefully amazing, on a technology stack that is controlled without us having a proper access to it, it's really hard for me to properly dream. We need to actually have the control of the technology. Otherwise, it's I like to think of it as an adversarial dependency. it's not like a pencil or something like this. It's like, again, it mediates through all our interaction and eventually our cognition. So we should be extremely careful in terms of being able to dream and build, but on a system we can actually rely on.
Thank you. And Klaus, you have your hand up.
Yes, only a brief comment. I fully support this this statement, because I also believe it is important to have systems which could interoperate. But in the real world, we see that companies are creating their own closed systems. Could be huge companies like example, forcing basically everyone else to participate. The problem I see also is that whoever controls such a this only one system basically would also control the information flow to a large extent. So we all are slaves basically in such a system. And if we would focus on decentralized systems, if we would focus on open standards and open protocols for communicating and data exchange, we could actually create many different islands which communicate, and we would actually, take away something from, single companies towards the community, or towards for the benefit of the citizens and worldwide, basically. So I fully support this idea.
Thank you.
Yeah, Dene, just to comment on Klaus there, because the issue of infrastructures, metadata stuff is of course extremely close to my heart, and I know everyone here. We are primarily working on WebXR because we're not building apps for just commercial purposes. But I was just telling my friend Anne at the back there, leaning over, saying that's Klaus. He's my external examiner. And I was going to I made kind of a mental joke. We've had a lot of discussions of these latent spaces, which is something 5 years ago you sit in a coffee shop and talk nonsense about, but now it's something that people in the room are actually productizing, which is incredible. And I was just thinking, you have asked me to do revisions for my thesis. And of course, one of the things I could do is use some of these latent spaces to have it rewritten in like more academic language. I'll try not to do that now that I've told you. But it just seems like an example of something. Of course, it's partly AI, but if you are in a virtual reality space, you literally have more space to see different interpretations of documents, whether what you're writing or what you're reading. So inspired by Klaus to talk about that, I'm wondering if there are other thoughts on this, because at some point, a lot of knowledge product will have to be packaged, right? Otherwise it will disappear. Links rot, a lot of things just disappear over time. At some point, you got to have something solid in some way. So I'm just wondering if there are thoughts on the panel on this.
I'd like to step up and talk about that just for a second, because I have the lab at the university where we do a lot of preservation work and restoration work. And so the 3,000 works I mentioned yesterday that I showed in the next, probably a good 1,500 we've had to restore or completely reconstruct. That's a lot of effort. And that's just work that was, flash based from, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Works that were even works that were hypertextual in 1997, we had to go through and restore the sound files, shifting them from MIDI into MP3s. So we've done a lot of what I call intervention into the works so that they're accessible today, right? I mean, that's part of the problem with accessibility and these works. So as we move towards working in VR, we're using Unity and Unreal Engine and all these other, all these different things, these different software programs. The issue I want in horror is I watch this and I go, how am I going to save this? How in God's name am I going to take this work and maintain it? We can videotape it through, and document it that way. We can write about it and do erratic writing. But how do I make that work available, accessible to someone in 5 years, 2 years, 1 year? I mean, the works that we produced, my lab, my program created a wonderful installation at the OMSI Museum that was an augmented reality installation in the turbine room. It was only good for 3 years. And then the technology, was corrupted. And so then that had to move out. And that's just, there's a 4-year kind of window when these things can live. So how do we even make these things that we're producing in VR last, or even think about them before we even start, so they're built to last a little longer than 3 years? And I'll turn this over to other people. I'm seeing lots and lots of discussions in here.
In the chat, okay, but here's a really concrete example for the final times. And please note, people in the room here cannot read the chat. We will, of course, read it later, but the volume of information we produced together over the last 2 days, plus the written contributions, how would you like to go through that? You know, you go home, put on your headset, forget the headset, but you just have a magical space of reading and dealing with this information. If you have thoughts on how you want to go through the book itself, that will be incredible articles to include in the book. And I want them as soon as possible, because I have heard whispers, it may not be correct, that even next month, the Apple VR headset will be available for developers. And once we see what they're telling us, we're going to be so clouded by that. I know I said this in my introduction, but now I'm being really, really specific and asking you, put your headset on, and the corpus we're dealing with is your contribution to this community and how you extract value from everyone else in the community. I want to know specific things that potentially a programmer could make. Obviously, not in code or descriptive, but something real. The realer it is, then it can inspire people to make it. And also, don't forget, in 100 years, people will need our unblemished visions of what it could be. It's so important. So even if you send me a paragraph handwritten in the middle of the night of something you think is neat, we'll put it in the book. You know, if you write a long piece, we could put that in too. Anything you want, but we've got to capture these dreams, not just in this hour, but over the next, let's say, 2 weeks, so we have some time to wrap it up. Yes.
Rhoda, on that note, I just real quickly would say that the thing that I would like to see in the context outside of VR, but in the context of what you're, you know, the future of text book would be trying out, playing with the new OpenAI Whisperer or some variant of that can auto summarize topics either on YouTube or whatnot, and get a version, be able to get an opinionated version of this document where if I, you know, be even better if I have a way to disagree with what the summary is, but at least to get some kind of summary view as an option of an opinion of this kind of corpus, because reality is I'm not going to be able to read through all of that, right? But I'd love to get the top level ideas. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm imagining like how you can make these kinds of transformations. Imagine that you have these large amounts of text, and imagine that you have this space. Right now we were showing in 2D, but we can imagine in 3D how you make transformations on all this knowledge. Maybe you decide where the things, now you have all the space. Imagine, I don't know, I want to have imagine myself like in the middle working in a kind of piece of text, but maybe I have inspirations in my right, or I have, for example, I imagine that in some place I have my tools for divergence, and in another space I'm making some gestures and things, I don't know. I'm making provocations here, but imagine that, for example, I have a book or an embedding of a book or what we are talking in this conference, and it's like, okay, I put it in some like a petri dish, and this petri dish, it transforms this text or all this knowledge, and I have I consume this thing that I have generated. Now I put it on.
So if I give you JSON of the book, will you help us do that?
Yeah, we can think about how we can.
I just thought I'd ask you in public.
Yeah. We can explore how to do it. Yeah, I got something direct.
The interface could be very simple and not even evolutionary. It could be as simple as here is a summary of the entire book, and then these sentences that have been summarized connect to these authors who feel this way, you know, and that could even be your way of hijacking a prompt. You know, if you click on this cluster of authors that seems to be saying the same kind of idea, then it expands on it. You know, anyway, yeah, I think that would be great.
Yeah, or even asking questions, no, to this knowledge, how we can extract some kind of, imagine that now because we envision a little bit like these interfaces being like more generative search, like how we can make these transformations within the text and how we can make it easier to access the information that we already have. No?
I see Kate has her hand up, which is wonderful. I just wanted to underline what this, we're going to produce a PDF, we're going to produce a printed book, but also it's going to be in VR. We'll have different ways to use it, and we're going to look at different ways for these prompts and latent spaces to help us interact with it. So the better and clearer you write and give us, the better this product situation interaction will be. Caitlin, please.
I was just going to add to that. This is actually a great example of where VR can be helpful, because I was really thinking about the Cave at Duke and one of these experiences that I sort of alluded to this morning, where I remember walking into it. It was basically an immersive link node visualization, and very much like the last speaker, you could actually take a look at who was working on the same stuff. You could look at funding structures. You could see what kinds of, I think it was around cancer research. You could see what had been starved, who was working internationally, what were orphaned projects, and you could see that instantly. It was like being inside a political economy textbook, where the entire knowledge domain was intelligible in about 10 minutes. And it was really interesting being able to be in an immersive environment and access that. It was fast, and the patterns were sort of, anyway, it was a very intuitive way to approach the kinds of things. And also I found it really particularly interesting to see the clusters, but also to see the things that weren't there, which I think were easier to do in VR than it would have been in a book. Because
what was the thing that you're referring to?
It was years ago. It was at Duke University. They had a 6-sided VR cave, and it was an immersive knowledge domain visualization that I believe was looking at research funding. I'm thinking it was cancer, but it was some kind of medical funding. But it's really just by way of example of the kinds of knowledge domain that might benefit from immersive as opposed to just flat.
So before Dene closes this section, Scott just had a suggestion I think is worth mentioning, and that is asking all of you to help edit your own transcripts to make sure that they are good. But I think also, if you want to provide a written piece that is the power of text supreme, because you've thought about it, that's absolutely great. Whether you want your transcript included in the book or not is really up to you. Maybe we just have it as the background corpus for the knowledge. Maybe you don't think it's clean enough. That's up to you. But the point is, we all have to take, I hate the word, but kind of responsibility for our own contributions. I'm saying that in a nice way, not just to avoid heavy work for me as co-editor. Dene.
Does anyone else have comments? We have, I think, about 5 more minutes or so before we wrap up completely. Any of the last minute? Yes, Klaus.
I have another comment, sorry. I believe that it's what I'm struggling some sort of with VR, not because I do not believe it would not be beneficial, but there is a glimpse of, you know, it's somewhat new, and people are attracted to new things, new visuals. In particular, I remember, you know, when I saw the first, you know, real, you know, visual effects made by computers in movies. I mean, this was like, wow, you know, this is something which I was attracted to. When I thought about, you know, the first music video I saw with computer graphics elements, you know, I thought, you know, this is really great, it's cool. But cool is not something that should be a measurement with respect to, you know, the use of such systems. So, and I'm directing this argument especially to the academics among us. I believe we always should try to figure out what is, you know, what is the real benefit people have. So do we actually, you know, create more knowledge? Do we get more connections between bits of knowledge? Do we get information more quickly? Do we get, you know, and how could we measure that? That's another question we should actually put on VR in text. How can we measure the efficiency, and how can we measure what do we actually want to measure with respect to, you know, something that brings humanity one step further, which is beneficial for all of us. So it's not just the coolness factor. It's not just because, you know, it's shiny and blinky, but there should be something more substantial to it, and we should not forget that.
That's what I meant by what we need as opposed to just what we want. I think we should start, blue sky means we generate ideas. There's no.
Oh, no, I'm not criticizing that. It's completely fine. But at the end, we need to show something that it's really beneficial and not just cool.
Okay, on the topic of the symposium on the book, I think what you did there is really important. You made a clear statement of a question and you made an assertion. I think that maybe also talking to you guys for the contributions to the book, don't just necessarily write a long piece of your entire life history and your insight into VR at the end. But if you want to write one small piece like that, where you make only that point, Klaus, I would love to put that in the book because it's so much more findable and readable. And if you want to write 10 different pieces like that, that's totally fine. Now, Jim Strayhorn and Bob Horn are really strong proponents of make it really clear and hierarchical what you're writing, right? And Jim, for example, already does that. There's a lot of bolding and a lot of layout, okay? So if we all just say, here's my statement on this, here's my statement on that, it's going to be easier to run AIs around that. It's going to be easier to lay them out in virtual space. So thank you for making that example of what we should put in. And when you're talking about shiny things, you're saying it in the company of Ken Perlin, who made a lot of those shiny computer graphics in the early days. So I thought that was very, very amusing.
I did want to say something. I guess I get a little extra moment because you said that. Just in terms of your little snippets, I personally find that, I mean, I teach VR. I teach a class in VR every year, and there are students use it for all kinds of things. The only thing I keep going back to VR for personally is when I want to design a room or a house or an art gallery, and I put it together and I'm in it and there it is and I can walk around in it. And I find I don't actually go to VR for other things, but for that, it's kind of like there's no substitute to just, I see the room before it exists. And I'm sure everybody has their own version, but for me, that's a very, very specific, I couldn't do that and now I can.
Thank you.
Oh, I have one last thought. I'd like to lay out a challenge to any biomedical researchers who might watch this recording down the road. And that's I think those of us who have experienced trouble with VR and have sim sickness issues, those issues, from what I understand, are tied to our inner ears not reflecting motion that our body is actually experiencing. So my challenge to you would be, find a way to externally, artificially stimulate those nerves in our inner ear to provide us with a corresponding sense of motion to match what our visual system is being provided with, so that we don't have our body senses coming out of phase with the virtual world being generated around us. I have no idea if it's possible, but it might be a neat research challenge for someone with that background.
Thank you. I want to mention that, let me mention a couple of years ago, I was part of a project with the science program on our campus. They were having trouble having enough microscopes to teach with, and students were breaking them, and it's costing a lot of money. So we built a VR prototype of a microscope that would be taught. Students could actually work with a microscope and learn the parts of a microscope and how to manipulate it, using that as the teaching element, as opposed to giving them a real microscope and watching them flummox with it and potentially break it. It was a useful way of thinking about VR.
So Vint Cerf was in VR for the first time ever yesterday, and he's not become a complete convert at all. However, he did accept that when you now put on a headset, the world you see is rock solid. You move your head, there's no wobbling, there's nothing. Whatever's being displayed is there. So I think that going back to Fabienne's 3D desk is really, really important. We need to dream into Jaron Lanier strange worlds. Absolutely no question we need to do that. But at the same time, a lot of work is done sitting down on a desk or just standing up. I think few people are going to be able to get rid of their desk so you can have a fully walkable VR environment. So the physical desk will be there even if you've mapped the room or not. So when it comes to VR nausea, I have that too. But it's very rare that I actually move in VR. You know, I have a big screen, I do this, I have this there. And then you have the magic grabbing abilities. Even with these kind of primitives we already have, a lot can be done. But we haven't backed it into, let's say, a product. There is no iPhone yet, that everybody can pick up and it's actually useful for them. I'm not saying we should dumb it down. This is for knowledge work, but some kind of an interaction experience has to be wrapped together for those basic knowledge work things. So when you do your dreaming and your writing, think about something as simple as normal desk, magical view.
Frodo, you just went silent. Okay. Hey, Frodo, it is now almost 9 o'clock. I think it's time to close the session. Did you want to say some? Let me say this. I want to thank Frodo for putting on this conference, for inviting us all, for organizing this. He's a one-man show, essentially, and definitely a phenomena. Thank you so much for doing all of this work, for organizing this beautiful space that you have, and bringing us together to dream about the future. Can we all give him a round of applause? And Frodo, I think you want to say a few words.
Yeah, I want to say, having a bit of applause is, I'm not a musician, so I'm not used to it, but it is very nice. And the reason that is very nice is because, you guys are here. Some of you flew in from the other side of the world. Some of you woke up in the middle of the night. Why is that?
It's 5 p.m.
Oh, there we go. It's not because that's actually the voice of Lisa, voiced by Janine, who's on the call from Australia. So that's quite amusing. But anyway, the reason it makes me so happy to have that kind of an ending, it really shows that you guys understand the issue that working in VR will not be automatically brilliant, that it will require dreaming, and also it will require lots of communication in this community. So we have our monthly meetings. Some of you have been there. Barbara presented. Ken has been there, which was amazing. So please, let's stick together and let's focus on this core issue of working in VR with text and see if we can really help people understand the issues around that. I thank you again and have a wonderful rest of the day, evening, morning, wherever you are in the world.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right, so I'm going to save this chat for myself, and then I think we'll have this recording. Frodo, do you want to speak very briefly about what happens with the recordings, what you're going to do with them all?
Yeah, what I will try to do, because we had some computer issues here and there with what's being recorded. We have a whatever camera also filming. So I'm going to try to, over the next few days, put it into some coherent whole. So that'll be the background. But I think in the background, there you go. Sorry, that's a local joke. But also this thing about keeping the communication going, coming to the monthly meetings if you feel like it, but also writing a thing. Writing a thing is so important because someone can refer to it. Like the statement with Klaus, if he puts that in a citable location, like our journal is not important or anything, but it means that we can cite each other. That is so important when we start building our knowledge. So that was answering more than your question. The basics is I'll try to make something coherent. We'll try to get a transcript. Everybody have a look at it and we'll go together from there.
What's the deadline for the book project?
It needs to be in proper published version by the end of the year because it's the third volume of the book. But also because of the scary deadline of maybe Apple will show something in October. I really want a draft version to be up as soon as possible. So the only thing that's guaranteed to go in there is your written contributions. So we'll try to put that in whatever form, even if it's not so well done, because at least we can say that was said before these things happened. If the date's very clear. And some people have asked for other people's contact details. So what I'm going to do is introduce everybody, unless someone has an issue with that. So please send me an email or a message today saying if you want your email redacted or something like that. And of course, I'll try to respect that. No, I will.
And I recommend that we do a list of names of participants, their email addresses, and their URLs to their portfolios or websites.
Yeah, that's in the glossary of the draft already. And the glossary has the bios, and it's kind of boring looking, but in the original document, it's all in JSON. So that's how we can pull it into the VR views that we've had already. So basically, it's the
I was
most,
thinking of a mailing list, like a list.
yeah, we can have that too, but just to repeat the most obvious thing in the world, the better structured data you give me, the better structured data we'll have of our record. You know, and we really care about these issues. We're not going to dump these things down.
Get ready for school. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.